Welcome. This Interpreter Roundtable covers Book of Mormon, Lesson 10, the title of which is He Inviteth All to Come Unto Him. My name is Martin Tanner. Joining me tonight is Bruce Webster. This is an exciting roundtable. There's a lot of great information in here. The purpose of the lesson is to help class members understand that through the restoration, the teachings of the Book of Mormon, and other resources, the Lord will cause truth to triumph over evil. So the message here is a great one. Truth will triumph over evil. Great message for today, a time in which people have apparently a lot of reasons to lose faith in God. Belief levels in God are down in a number of places throughout the world. And even in areas where God is still a fixture in the hearts of so very, very many people, are still discouraged for other reasons. And so this message of truth prevailing over evil is a wonderful message. Our lesson today covers 2nd Nephi, chapters 26 through 30. And to give us sort of a general overview about what those lessons, or what these chapters describe, Bruce Webster.
Thanks. We in the church are so immersed in the Book of Mormon and so familiar with it that I think we lose sight of how unique Nephi is as a prophet. He has these extensive, detailed prophecies, first of the history of his people going forward, and the eventual destruction of what he terms the Nephites, and then detailed prophecies about the life of Christ, about his rejection, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and then detailed prophecies about the apostasy following that, and then detailed prophecies about the restoration in the last days prior to the second coming of Christ. And if you go and try and pull this out of the Bible, you've got bits and pieces, and you've got a few comments and a lot of dispute among different Christian Bible commentaries about what they mean. And with Nephi, we have chapter after chapter after chapter laying it out in detail. And it's a priceless treasure. Now, sometimes, there are members who struggle with that, saying, well, how come, we have in Nephi all this detail? And it's because God revealed it to him. And then we sort of, some people say, well, God couldn't do that. And my reaction is like, oh, really? You obviously know something about God that I don't. So with all that said, these three chapters, chapter 26 is basically Nephi talking about the destruction of his people, and then the apostasy that's going on among the Gentiles. And then 27 talks about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and 28 talks about just how bad things will be in the last days. And as you know, I've cited, I think, in some of these roundtables so far, he Nibley famously said, woe unto the generation that understands the Book of Mormon. Because we know what Nephi laid out, and we also know what happened to the Nephites. And so when you look around in the world and say, this reminds me of something I read in Nephi, 2nd Nephi chapter 28, or, this is just like what happened in Helaman is before the Nephites, went through their first destruction. There's a reason for good caution. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into the chapters, and I'll punt it back to Martin.
Chapter 26 tells us about the coming of Christ, and we should probably point out that This, according to the footnotes, which I think tend to be fairly accurate on the bottom right corner of the pages, this would be between about 559 and 545 BC. And according to the description of the Book of Mormon, Lehi and his party left approximately 600 BC, approximately, wandered around in the wilderness for about 10 years, give or take a little bit, and came over to the New World. Exactly how long the voyage took, we don't know. But let's say they arrived 590, give or take a little bit. That means there really has elapsed only about 30 to 45 or 50 years total. And yet here we're talking about this major shift in many ways about the way people believe, and we're hearing these prophecies about the future, about how much more the people will be changing, and about many, many future events. and I'll mention here a point that I've mentioned several times before in Book of Mormon Roundtables, that the way the narrative describes things, you must presuppose that there were already people here, that the people who are described here, Lehi and his party, did not fill up all of North or Central or South America. I'm trying to be completely politically correct about Book of Mormon geography. The point is, the land was not vacant wherever you choose to believe they landed. I have my beliefs about that. And the people here have already, in this short time period, had problems, which we will see real soon when we hear about priestcrafts and other things. But the first descriptions in chapter 26 are about Nephi foreseeing that Christ has risen from the dead, and that he will show himself unto his people and his brethren, his children, and that there will be wars and contentions. And then after the Messiah has come, there will be signs. There'll be signs that accompany his birth, his death, and his resurrection. And so there's a fascinating description, which must have been based on visions about the future and the way that Christ would be seen in the old world and the way he would be seen in the new. One of the most fascinating verses for me in chapter 26 is verse 12, where it describes Jesus in a way that I really like, but it's a way that's a little bit different from the terminology that we might use. And it says here, quote, "And as I spake concerning the convincing of the Jews that Jesus is the very Christ," so far so good, "it must needs be that the Gentiles be convinced also that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God," close quote. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. We all believe Christ is part of the Godhead, but we don't often tend to use the word eternal right in front of the word God and apply it to Jesus. We say he's God or the Son of God, but eternal God, that's usually the way we would describe God the Father. And fascinatingly enough, if you go back to 1 Nephi chapter 11, verses 18 and 21, where it's describing Mary, it talks about Mary, who is the mother of the Son of God. At least that's the way it reads now. In the earliest manuscripts of the Book of Mormon, it mentioned Mary as the mother of God. And somehow early Latter-day Saints thought there might be a problem with the terminology, and so ultimately the phrase the mother of the Son of God was inserted there. But that has not happened in verse 12 here in chapter 26, and I like that. We don't have to have the same exact terminology for everything that the Nephites did to me, it's another little sign that Joseph Smith has indeed translated this. Why? Because it's not a way that he would have put it together, and it's certainly not a way that we would tend to say it ourselves. And so I just love this little description of Jesus in chapter 26, verse 12 of 2nd Nephi. Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God. Indeed, that is a great description, just not the one that we would tend to use. All right. Another great comment here is about priestcrafts, which are mentioned here in verse 29. What do we know about priestcraft or priestcrafts? They are defined here. For behold, priestcrafts are that men preach and set themselves up for a light unto the world, that they may get gain and praise of the world, but they seek not the welfare of Zion. So the essential elements in a definition are people setting themselves up for a light to the world, but not for the right purposes, so that they can get gain and praise of the world, but not because they really seek the welfare of Zion. I won't go and list specific people or denominations which might fit here, but as we think about this definition, sadly, it is very, very widespread. We see it very, very widespread in many different contexts, and it's very sad, because in a way that means that people who don't have the right motives involved or sort of hijacking religion for an improper purpose with an improper motive. And that's a sad thing. And the Book of Mormon foresees that that is going to happen in the last days. Another verse here, which is a great favorite of mine, is the very next one, verse 30, where it talks about charity, and it says that there's a commandment that the Lord God has given. And what is it? It's that all men should have charity. Excuse me. Which charity is love? Why is that? Why does that mean so much to me? Because the King James Bible, which was the real Bible of use at the time of Joseph Smith, which was in, I mean, by far and away, it was the Bible that you could find. There just weren't very many other translations that would have been readily available at all at the time. They would have described the way that Paul talked in Corinthians and in other places about charity. The word love wouldn't have been in there so very much. And in all the new translations which we have today, the emphasis and the translations use the word love. And here we've got both in the Book of Mormon. And it's so wonderful because it captures the two major ideas of the underlying word here, and the meaning which is conveyed is that you have this deep fondness and caring described as love for people. This is not a romantic love. When you think of charity, you're not thinking of passion. You're thinking of someone who has this deep godly love, the kind of a love that Christ would have, that God, our Father, would have, the kind of love that parents have for their children, that kind of deep, deep love. And what does that deep kind of love bring? It brings the desire to help and to serve and to lift others up, which is the whole concept behind charity. So I just love the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith is inspired to translate both of those words, which capture the meaning so well for us in English. Bruce, back to you. I think I'm mostly done with chapter 26 here. You'll need to unmute.
My apologies. First, I want to underscore what you said about priestcrafts. This is one of the major themes of the Book of Mormon. And we will see a number of characters up here who, in essence, are practicing priestcraft. And it's identified by it. It is also, it is a danger within the church today. Not among the church leadership, but among members who set themselves up for power and influence and not to seek the welfare of Zion. I think back about one individual whom I knew with an Ivy League PhD and so on, who talked to me quite frankly about planning out his church career. And his intent to eventually end up as a general authority, and to a certain extent he was guileless. It's like he saw absolutely nothing wrong with what he was describing. But he's saying, well, I'm gonna start giving firesides and wait to be called as a bishop or a stake president, and I'll work my way up the chain and so on. And this was all about 30 years ago, and I remember being mildly appalled, if not a little fascinated. And so it's a caution. It's in there because it's one of the themes of the Book of Mormon. It's one of the things we need to be careful of nowadays. Moving on. The last verse is a powerful one to me, verse 33. He said, for none of these deeds, he's just finished listing things, the evil that men do. And he says, for none of these iniquities come of the Lord, for he doeth that which is good among the children of men. And he doeth nothing, save it be plain unto the children of men. And he inviteth them all to come unto him and partake of his goodness. And he denieth none that come unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female, and remembereth the heathen, and all are alike unto God, both Jew and Gentile. Now, this is, frankly, for both the context of Nephi, and if one is trying to argue for a naturalistic explanation of the Book of Mormon, frankly, for the context of 1830 America, in both contexts, that's a fairly radical statement that he's laid out there. Most of the Christian world at that point, saw the heathens as all going to hell, and frankly saw the Jews as going to hell too. Black and white were not casual relationships in 1830 America. Slavery was in full swing. So this is a remarkable statement, and I've pondered on this, because I think that we, I wrote a post on my LDS blog 8 years ago. That's a little scary, and I'm just going to read a paragraph that directly was inspired by this verse. I said, I believe we're not only guilty of chauvinism regarding our personal characteristics, our accomplishments, or our self-selected social intellectual group, we are guilty of temporal and cultural chauvinism as well. We often assume, consciously or not, that God is more nuanced with us in these latter days than, say, with the Israelites in 7th century BC Judah, because we are more sophisticated and educated. In fact, we often limit what we believe God could have told such people simply because of the historical setting. For example, God could not have really told Nephi details about the birth and life of Jesus Christ, and so it must be a late addition to the Book of Mormon. Unspoken but lurking beneath such assumptions is the assumption, well, God hasn't told me anything in such detail, so how could he have done it with Nephi or anyone else for that matter? Again, from where God sits, there is no measurable difference in our cultures, philosophies, and levels of education. The fact that we have iPhones, the internet, the ensign, and dialogue, and that the Israelites did not, is meaningless in the context of the infinite gap between us and God. And then I go on to quote Orson Scott Card from Saintspeak, where he defines Mormons as people who believe that the only difference between them and God is a few years of training. which oh, that's such a struggle within a church. It's kind of like, well, you know, we're going to die and we're going to go through a few seminars and hey, presto, we're going to become a god. It is. We've already had the lessons on the need for an infinite atonement. One of the reasons it has to be an infinite atonement is because of the infinite nature of the gap in character and perfection between us and our Father in heaven. So it's good, I think, in your lessons, you who are watching this, just to stress verse 33 and to point out that when he says all are alike unto God, he's talking through all of time and space. We need to guard ourselves carefully against conscious or unconscious assumptions that we are somehow more enlightened or more favored because the differences between us and all other peoples really isn't that great when you look at the differences between us and God. So that's probably the last I have for 26.
You are so right. One of the wonderful things about the LDS faith is that we have this concept that as man is now, God once was, and as God is now, man may be. And that is a truism, and it's a wonderful truism because it does not put up any roadblocks between our ability to become like God. On the other hand, the downside to that, as Bruce, you mentioned, is that there's this idea you die, catch a few seminars, and I've never heard it put quite like that. That's great. That is absolutely great.
I honestly think that a lot of us in the church walk around with sort of that mental image. You know? So it's
I'm sure there's truth to that, but consider this. Who among us can think about more than one thing at a time?
Yeah.
Who among us knows exactly how the world was created? Who among us knows how to create a spirit child? Who among us knows how to shepherd a world so that it has both the influence of evil but sufficient influence from good so that ultimately good will prevail, and yet evil is there so that people will have the opportunity to choose? Who among us knows an iota of what's on the other side? And having been involved in studying near-death experiences for the past 30 years, I have a special interest in this, and I kind of smile when people say they have it all figured out, because having a near-death experience by definition is something that's very short in duration. And I often ask people, well, you know, if you spend 10 minutes in France, how much would you really know about France? Or if you spent 7 minutes in some other place in the world that you were visiting very, very briefly, how much would you really know about it? And if you've been to the other side, even for a very, very short time, by definition, you just know so very little that you know virtually nothing. And so when you stop to ponder the import of all of this, we really sort of have to admire all this King Benjamin-esque speech that he uses to bring us back down a little bit later to the context of where we fit in the entire scheme of things. Anyway, chapter 20, that's wonderful, and I appreciated very much what you had to say there, Bruce. Chapter 27 is one of my personal favorites because I've enjoyed studying two things that this chapter involves, and one of those is the Isaiah quotes in the Book of Mormon. There are so many people who have just superficially looked at these as, oh, Joseph Smith, he went through, translated the Book of Mormon. When he got to the stuff that is out of the King James Bible, he just dictated it. He just flipped open that Bible and started to dictate. Well, there are a couple of problems with that. Number one is that there's not a single scribe of Joseph Smith who ever said that on a single occasion the Bible was referenced during the translation process. Instead, what is described over and over and over again, whether it's from the very beginning with Emma towards the very end, when you had Oliver Cowdery and some of the Whitmers and others, we don't even know all the scribes, but the point is that no one says that the Bible was consulted and quoted. They all say that Joseph Smith just spoke the words of the Book of Mormon with very, very little alteration later. I've taken the time to actually look through every page of what's left of the initial manuscript, the original manuscript, and what's available, which is much, much, much more, almost all of the printer's manuscript. And it's amazing to me every time I do it how few changes were made. There were some, and that's okay, because Joseph Smith dictated this in his, essentially in his own words. But so back to chapter 27, we have Isaiah 29 with some interesting changes and alterations, which was dictated by Joseph Smith without a copy of Isaiah 29 present, which is an amazing feat. And the other reason that I like chapter 29 is because it has this great description of the copying of the characters with Martin Harris, and then Martin Harris going off to Charles Anton to have these characters looked at and the translation checked to see if it's accurate. And every time I read through this, I'm amazed. And two things come to mind. One is that Martin Harris is a little bit unfairly maligned, even though, yeah, he lost 116 pages. And but the guy was caught. He was caught between trying to do two things that were very, very wonderful. And one of those is keep his household happy, which was a difficult thing to do with his wife and perhaps impossible. And another thing was that he was trying to do something that we are told to do over and over again, which is to study things out in your mind and to see what you think about them. Don't just rely completely on God. And I appreciate Martin Harris because he didn't just instantly kneel down and say, okay, tell me, Lord, is this good or not? And I'll just do whatever you say. He took the time to take a manuscript, run out, do his due diligence, and see what the scholars of the day thought about it. And I just think that's great. He did everything he could. And at the very end, he asked, and he was told this was a genuine work, and he was convinced. And so I for one, find him a wonderful guy, and perhaps to a certain extent unfairly maligned. Incidentally, he lived his very last days in northern Utah, in a small little town, and even though he was not officially a Latter-day Saint, he would come and bear a strong, strong testimony of the Book of Mormon. And it's just fabulous. I've read some transcripts of some of those talks, and he knew it was real. And you can tell by reading what he said that he knew it was real. And you have this beautiful synopsis in chapter 27 of exactly what happened. And it's audacious to have some scriptures here that say, in essence, here we've got this new fledgling religion in 1830, and you know what? It's fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah. Who would come up with that? no one would come up with that if it were not true. Anyway, I just love chapter 27 for that very reason. Back to you, Bruce.
Actually, not a lot to add to what you had to say. It is. I mean, it's very interesting that at one point Joseph didn't know yet that he was going to translate, and he wasn't sure what he was going to do. He'd got these plates. He wasn't sure how things were going to proceed, and Joseph was partially expecting Martin Harris to find a professor to help translate the plates. And it was only after Martin Harris came back and recounted his visits with Professor Anton and the other one whose name escapes me right now, who actually saw first, that Joseph began to realize that he was going to be the one to translate, and he was going to have to do it through the gift and power of God. Again, keep in mind, Joseph had about 3 years of education. He was a very bright individual, but not particularly a scholarly one. And what's marvelous about the application of Isaiah 29 to the whole process is the fact that it's a marvelous work and a wonder. I remain convinced that one of the principal purposes of the Book of Mormon is to leave the world without excuse. Because the more you investigate, the more you dig into the Book of Mormon on all levels, the context, the text, the complexity, the events surrounding its translation. And there's actually a brand new book that's come out by two of the scholars who are working on a Joseph Smith Papers project that is the most up-to-date and accurate account of, almost not quite day by day, but basically step by step through the entire translation process in the Book of Mormon, what happened. The more you look at this, it's like, how are you going to explain this book away? And you end up with the famous quote, which Dan Peterson just quoted in his most recent Deseret News column from Thomas O'Day, saying, the Book of Mormon is one of those books in which it's considered that you don't have to read it to have an opinion about it. In my experience, most people have negative opinions about the Book of Mormon really have failed to engage it at all, and it failed to engage the book, its text, its history, and the tremendous amount of scholarship that surrounds it. And I think it's one of the things the Lord will use at the last day to say, people say, well, how would you know? He said, well, I set up this church and they had this book, and there was really no reasonable explanation for the book other than the explanation that was given as to how it came to pass, and that it was a true history. And if you chose to ignore that, that was your choice. So anyway, wonderful chapter, and it truly is a marvelous work and a wonder. It is my favorite book, and I learn new things on a regular basis studying it. So if your stake president or your bishop or Leaf Society president, whatever, issues a challenge to reread the Book of Mormon, don't say, "Oh, I've already read that once or twice." I learn new things all the time, and I've been studying it for 40 plus years. And back to you, Martin.
Chapter 28, we have this description of the time in which the Book of Mormon comes forth. And they're vivid, not just because of their accuracy, but because of the way that they describe things so accurately and succinctly. In chapter 28, verse 6, we have this statement that this is coming forth basically in a time when people don't believe that there are miracles. The specific quote is, "Behold, hearken ye unto my precept. If they shall say, there is a miracle wrought by the hand of the Lord, believe it not. For this day he is not a God of miracles. He has done his work." That's what's believed. And a few lines later, we have, well, I'll even go back and say the very next line, verse 7 of chapter 28 of 2nd Nephi says, "Yea, there shall be many which shall say, Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, and it shall be well with us." And then verse 8 has a similar concept, saying, "Eat, drink, and be merry, nevertheless fear God. He will justify in committing a little sin. Lie a little, take the advantage of one because of his words. Dig a pit for thy neighbor. There's no harm in this. Do all these things, for tomorrow we die. And hey, if we're beaten with a few stripes, no worries, we're all going to be saved in the kingdom of God in the last days." And then these are all lumped under vain and foolish teachings. And if you were to go out and conduct a little poll, you would find all of these beliefs running rampant. The Mormons, they can't be telling the truth. How do we know that? There are no more new scriptures. There are no new miracles. All that stuff ended with Jesus and the apostles. There's nothing new like that. Nobody can be perfect. So let's all just have a good time. If you can't be perfect, we'll just have a good time. And, you know, if you do a few things wrong, that's all right. God's a very loving, good guy. And so it'll all be okay anyway. This just mirrors what the Book of Mormon says. And it's so tragic and does not lead to happiness, which is sort of the implicit underlying statement here, or perhaps the idea that one can be happy doing bad things, coupled with the notion that what we really do doesn't have a consequence. Do whatever you want to, doesn't matter, it'll all work out in the end. That's a tragic idea, and one that never makes us happy. The Book of Mormon is very sober in many different places, with the intent that we will become happy. And the way that we become happy through the Book of Mormon is to understand what God's commandments are and then to keep them. Another very sobering part of chapter 28 I've always enjoyed and cringed at a little bit, because it describes many people, I think. Verse 21, verse 22, "And others he will pacify and lull them away into carnal security, that they will say, All is well in Zion. Yea, Zion prospereth, all is well. And thus the devil cheateth their souls, and leadeth them away carefully down to hell. And others he flattereth away, and telleth them, There is no hell. And he saith unto them, I am no devil, for there is none. And thus he whispereth in their ears until he grasps them with his awful chains, from whence there is no deliverance." Here, it's even more sobering, because it's obviously referring to believers, or at least purported believers, because they're saying Zion prospers. And these are people whose souls are being cheated. And there are others who believe there is no devil, or if he does exist, they're doing fine, so they don't have to worry about him. And then they're carefully led down to hell. Tragic ideas, very sobering thoughts, because there's probably not a single soul who does not worry a little bit about this. which is fascinating. One of the major arguments I've heard against our faith is that you Latter-day Saints, you're always worried because you're never secure in knowing that you're going to make it to heaven. I know I've been saved because, on May 16th of 1987, I found Jesus, and so I know I'm saved. And the tragic part about that is that they believe it. And the other tragic part about it is that there's the idea that being concerned about your own salvation, being concerned about how you conduct your life, isn't a good thing. The church and the Book of Mormon and our general authorities all tell us that we do need to be concerned. Where did that whole phrase, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling? That's a truism. And these verses of chapter 28, specifically verses 21 and 22, convey that meaning to us very, very well. Back to you, Bruce. Mike. Bruce, we need you to unmute your mic.
Apologies. I've been reading off and on in the mornings at breakfast Hugh Nibley's An Approach to the Book of Mormon, which was the Melchizedek Priesthood study guide for 1957. As a brief aside, those who've actually read Hugh Nibley may say, really? They used the Hugh Nibley book for the study guide? Apparently David O. McKay said, oh, it'd be good for the brethren to work a little at it. Let them struggle a little here. It's a wonderful book. It's still, frankly, there are a few things which I think have Book of Mormon scholarship has probably moved on that he posits, but I'd say 90% of it is still spot on, which is always remarkable. Nibley was there decades before everyone else in his treatment of it. And one of the things he points out is the Book of Mormon. Again, this is a book that's published in 1830, presages modern rationalism 50 years before it really became a movement in Western civilization. It's reflected here. It's reflected in Korihor's argument, about, there is God, there's no God, and what a man does in this life is no crime, and so on. I mean, it is a remarkable portrayal of the intellectual trends that were going to come about in the last days, and they're basically set forth at a time when those trends were not present in Western civilization, when Western civilization was still, at least in lip service, and of course Book of Mormon talks about that as well, was fairly devout. And it continues to be applicable. I was looking at this and thought of some of the recent controversies and people being upset with stuff that has come forth from the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 and so on. And here I am looking at verses 26 through 29. Yea, woe be unto him that hearkeneth unto the precepts of men and denieth the power of God and the gift of the Holy Ghost. Yea, woe be unto him that saith, we have received and we need no more. And in fine, woe unto all who tremble and are angry because of the truth of God. And woe be unto him that shall say, we have received the word of God and we need no more of the word of God, for we have enough. One of the brilliant aspects of the church, and by golly, God knew just what he was doing, is the fact that we have not a single founding set of, a prophet and his original 12 apostles, and that it. We have continual prophet, set of apostles, and we rely on modern revelation. We recognize that, particularly given the events and circumstances of the last days, we're going to need new instructions. Old practices and instructions may change, and so on. And as Artist Partial, who keeps the wonderful Keep the Pitchin' In blog, wrote a few weeks ago, she said, you know, I'm not sure what the point of a prophet is if I only accept his leadership when he follows me. They're one of the big themes of the Book of Mormon is people rejecting the Word of God. I mean, that's from chapter 1 with Lehi preaching in Jerusalem, and it continues all the way through to Mormon and Moroni at the end, with people getting angry when the Lord's prophets basically say, here's what needs to happen, this is what's going to happen, here's what we need to do. And it's good for us to remember, as verse 31 says, cursed is he that putteth his trust in man, or maketh flesh his arm, or shall hearken unto the precepts of men, save their precepts shall be given by the power of the Holy Ghost. So it's important for us to recognize that the Lord has things set up the way he does for a purpose. And, you know, none of us are perfect, you know, from the youngest child in nursery all the way up to the prophet. But the Lord's house is a house of order. He knows how to run it. And what he expects from us when we've raised our hands is to support and sustain those who've been called to bear those burdens of stewardship.
Thank you. Great comments. Chapter 29. I love chapter 29. It's this, a Bible. We have a Bible and there can't be any more Bible. Starting in verse 3. This notion that the Book of Mormon is going to come in a day when people will reject it and other scriptures because they have a Bible and there won't be anything else. And the fascinating part about this is that there really were very, very, very few scriptures other than the Bible available in Joseph Smith's time. I mean, there were some. There were certainly some. But not many. Today, the thing that makes this such a great verse, of course, is, you know, this is produced in the early 1800s, before we had this massive unleashing through archaeology of so many other scriptures, at least books that were scriptures to the early Jews. Examples, the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in 1947. People scratched their heads and said, well, what should we do with these? This is stuff that's outside the Bible. But the Jews that had these, the Qumran community on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea, they believed these were scriptures. And by the way, there were about 900 books there. They're not just a few. And many of them were scriptures to them. Some of them were secular works. Others would have been, I guess, miscellaneous. But that was an amazing find. And if Joseph Smith had just made this book himself, he would not have written it the way he did, because he's talking about other books coming from the Jews, from the lost tribes of Israel, and from the Nephites. Now, the fascinating one that I'd like to focus in here on initially is the Jews. I've talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Next, let's shift to the lost tribes of Israel. At the time of Joseph Smith, you had this, well, there were three big ideas about where the lost tribes were. And some of these floated into the early church because they were common ideas of the time. Number one, they were just scattered amongst the nations of the Middle East and Northern Europe. Number two is that they were the Native American Indians. Actually, I said three, but there were four. Number three is that they were off on another planet or part of the earth that had been taken away to some other location. And the fourth one is that they were in this great cavern at the North Pole, down in the center of the earth. A couple of big flaws with that one. We know that the North Pole is just a sheet of ice now. There's no ground in there to even tunnel into, so that one doesn't work too well. And on another planet would be a bit difficult as well. And so that really leaves you with the idea that the lost tribes were scattered about on the earth. And the Book of Mormon picks the one that really works. It talks about the lost tribes. It mentions in verse 11, islands of the sea. These are descriptions about places on the earth. These are not descriptions about other odd, quirky ideas of the time the Book of Mormon was produced. These are descriptions that still work today and are a testimony that this was something that was given by God and not by Joseph Smith or some other person of the time. Because if it had been of the time, it would have had a different description in here. And because of that, I just love this section. It talks about other scriptures which weren't commonly known then, and it talks about the lost tribes being in different locations on the earth. I love this chapter 29, and it has irony in the words as it describes the people of the time, and it talks with great force and power about additional scriptures that will come forth, including the Book of Mormon, and presents the argument, which is very similar to ones Bruce has made already. Well, wait a minute, who says God can't come up with an actual name from the future? Really? Well, here, who says God can't produce more scriptures? Really? You're telling us God can't produce more scriptures? Well, where would that idea come from? And here God is saying in chapter 29 that he indeed will produce more scriptures. That's a very bold statement. And that's what I have to say about chapter 29. Back to you, Bruce.
Oh, I'll build on what you said about what the contemporary feelings and beliefs were and how the Book of Mormon contradicts them. Jews were not viewed favorably by Christianity in 1830. The general Christian view was that the Jews had killed Christ, that God had rejected them as his covenant people, and that it now passed to the Christians, and frankly, that Jews were going to go to hell. That was pretty much a pervasive belief in 1830. And then you've got verses 4 and 5 here. Actually, 4 and 5, well, 4 and 5, and then the rest of the chapter. But God says, the only reason you have the Bible is because of the Jews. And he says, have you remembered the Jews, my covenant people? Nay, but ye have cursed them and hated them, and have not sought to recover them. But behold, I will return all these things upon your own heads, for I, the Lord, have not forgotten my people. That's diametrically opposed to just about everything that was pervasive in Christianity in 1830 regarding the Jews. Christians saw themselves, we're the chosen people, we're the new covenant, so on and so forth. Jews are damned, and so on. And here you have God furiously condemning the Gentiles for their treatment of the Jews, specifically condemning anti-Semitism, and saying, you're going to have to answer for what you've done. So it is a powerful, and once again we get into one of Nephi's biggest themes, and it was the same thing back in the verse, the last verse in chapter 26, is the universality of the gospel and plan of salvation, which again goes directly against, most, not all, but most religious trends at that time. We're talking US 1830. It's why I just shake my head when people say, oh, Joseph Smith just sort of soaked up everything that was around him and squeezed it out, and out came the Book of Mormon. It's like, oh, no. he didn't at all. Trust me. It goes directly against pretty much everything that was around him. And the rest of the chapter goes on, as Martin was pointing out. God says, I can talk to everyone. Says, I can talk to the Jews, I can talk to the Nephites, I can talk to the lost tribes, I can talk to other people. Don't try to tell me who I can't talk to and what I can't cause to be written. It's a fairly stern rebuke, but it's all within the context of the universality of the gospel plan, which is really one of the major distinguishing themes of Mormonism. And you see this, you see the doctrines unroll over a period of 20 or 30 years. Not only do you have the Book of Mormon talking about the universality of God's reaching out to all the people, but we start talking about post-mortem missionary work, and that those who died without baptism or ordinances or without hearing the gospel would have a chance, which again is it wasn't a new thought, but it's one that every time it arose in Christianity was vigorously suppressed. Well, at least on the Protestant side. In Catholicism, we did have the concept of purgatory and lighting candles and getting people out of purgatory and so on and so forth. But Joseph wasn't exposed to a lot of Catholics in upstate New York. Catholics weren't terribly popular in the U.S. in 1830 either. And indeed, keep in mind that there was still anti-Catholic prejudice around when John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960. So anyway, it's these chapters just underscore that the gospel is meant for everyone, and that God has worked with man throughout. And again, as opposed to the idea of, well, this is the God of some desert nomads from 1000 AD or 1000 BC. God's pointing out, I work with all nations, and do my best to lead them and cause them to write words. So it's a powerful message.
That it is a very powerful message. One of the things that I ought to mention also is that these statements about the Jews and how great they are and the significance of their scriptures, this was produced 125 years, give or take a year or two, before the state of Israel was formed.
Yeah.
There was no Israel over in the Middle East. It was a place that was inhabited by and large and run by other people. The Jews were not a great people at that point in time. They had been scattered and gone through millennia of difficulties and troubling times. And so these verses talking about the Jews in such glowing terms would have been far more foreign to the readers at the time the Book of Mormon was produced than they even would be to us right now. I only have a few more comments, and these would be about chapter 30. These, well, the initial verses of chapter 30 talk about the remnant of the seed of the people of Nephi. So even at this point in time, the Nephites are known to the writer Nephi as eventually being scattered. And there are statements here about the remnant being gathered again. And so there are some wonderful statements about gathering in. And this brings us to a place, and some may have heard this, some may not. In verse 6, there's another change in the Book of Mormon. In the original and in the printer's manuscript, verse 6 of chapter 30 said that not many generations would pass away, save they shall be a white and delightsome people. And if you read it in the current editions, it says a pure and delightsome people. And people say, oh, Book of Mormon were translated the right way. Why would the general authorities feel the need to change that? And here's the answer. At the time the Book of Mormon was produced, you didn't have this huge preoccupation, as we have today, with race and political correctness. And I am absolutely convinced, because of the context of this, that the whole idea of white and delightsome does not have some kind of a reference to race or to skin color. This is a reference to white as in beauty and cleanliness and purity.
Unstained garments.
That's right. The way someone would describe heaven. Yeah. Nothing to do with race whatsoever. And the description here is that the remnant of Nephi's people would eventually attain that wonderful state. This has nothing to do with attaining some kind of different ethnicity. It's just the wrong way to read it. And because people might read it that way, I like the change. Yeah. I like the change, even though I tend to be a purist and love to go back and read the original manuscript and Royal Skousen's works and efforts to get back to the original manuscript and things. I find that this is a good change because it will be more readily understood. And the last comment I have about chapter 30 is that it ends with this very, very powerful verse 18 of chapter 30. Wherefore all things have been revealed unto the children of men. Wherefore all things which have been revealed unto the children of men shall at that day be revealed, meaning in our time. And Satan shall have power over the hearts of the children of men no more for a long time. And now, my beloved brethren, I make an end of my sayings. So he's talking about the great time in the future as impacted by the Book of Mormon, which I do not believe will be too far off in the future, where the Book of Mormon and the influence of God will make it so that Satan won't have power over people, not because he's lost his power, but because people won't listen to him. Just a beautiful, positive comment about the future. I love it. Back to you, Bruce.
Okay. Just a few comments, and I'll start with the less spiritual one. I did notice the lesson manual quotes from a talk by President James E. Faust, whom I loved dearly. But he gives the analogy of the frog and the pot of boiling water, and that's actually been debunked any number of times. The frog will crawl out of the pot of water as soon as it becomes uncomfortably warm. So please, when you're teaching this lesson, don't use that analogy because it's not true, and you'll probably end up with at least one or two smart Alex in the class like me who'll say, well, actually. Some people have tried this and no, it doesn't work that way at all. And also, if you drop a frog into a pot of boiling water, he will get badly scalded, and if he survives being dropped in, he will try to crawl out. So it's a great visual analogy, but it just doesn't hold up. Anyway, that said, it's worth noting that to build on Martin's comments, Joseph Smith actually sent Orson Hyde to Palestine to dedicate it for the return of the Jews, and did this in 1841. There's actually if you Google Orson Hyde's 1841 missionary or 1841 mission to the Holy Land, there's actually a lengthy article on the church website about it. Or it looks like, I take that back. It looks like this was an Ensign article from 1991. The church has had a remarkably positive relationship with those of the Jewish faith compared to most Christian denominations, precisely because they look in the Book of Mormon and see stuff like the verses we've just read, and talking, the Lord basically threatening the Gentiles to answer upon their heads for how they have shamefully treated the Jews. It's that goodwill that led first to the Orson Hyde Memorial Garden on the Mount of Olives to commemorate his dedication in 1841. And actually, though it took years and a lot of discussions, to the founding of the BYU Jerusalem Study Center. And that in turn, I think, has led to a tremendous appreciation on the part of Latter-day Saints for the subtleties and complexities of the situation in Israel and in the Middle East. The recognition that there are issues and concerns all around. That said, Nephi has wrapped things up. He drags in Isaiah here and there and quotes or paraphrases him, and traces this whole arc, basically from his departure with his father and his family to Jerusalem to the millennium. It is a remarkable set of prophecies that stretch out through these and the earlier chapters. And this is all a coda having laid out. He says, I make an end of my prophecies, and he's going to spend the next 2 chapters talking about what is it we exactly need to do. And I'll leave that to whoever's got lesson 11, or if it's already been done. Probably has. But the point is, the Book of Mormon helps us to see ourselves in the context of God's history of dealing with the human race, and stresses that, as we talked about at the outset, all are alike unto him. It doesn't matter the era, it doesn't matter the race, it doesn't matter the country, it doesn't matter the ethnicity. All are alike unto God, and he invites all to come unto him. And as someone put it, and I can't tell you who exactly, within the church basically said, it seems clear that it is the intent of God in Christ to save everyone who's willing to be saved. And part of what the Lord has done to do that is to bring forth the Book of Mormon in these last days, because it is a powerful tool, not just for conversion, but a powerful tool to keep us focused on what's really important in life and to keep us repenting. So great lesson, great stuff. Hope you all who are teaching have a good time with this lesson. Shout out to my daughter Heather, who listens to these and teaches Gospel Doctrine. Hope you all have found these useful, because heaven knows we have a good time putting them together. Back to you, Martin.
We always do. Thanks for joining us for this roundtable. Bruce Webster and Martin Tanner, thank you. and invite you to go to other places on our Roundtable website, or excuse me, on our interpreter website to see the other things there, like items published and other fun things, symposia, and offerings. Join us again. Thank you.